I am pleased to welcome the esteemed Professor Pottinger today. Today, we're going to really be exploring migration, its impacts, and what we might be able to do to mitigate the impacts of migration. So let's begin, Prof. Can you tell us a little bit about your interest in the work?
Sure. I would actually say that I've done a lot of work in this area more in the early 2000s. And one of the reasons was I was getting several persons in my practice or in my clinic, because I have a clinic at the university hospital where I teach and work at. And they could present with varying mental health concerns. And I found that parental migration was coming up a lot. So I started exploring this thing called migratory separation, because it doesn't have to necessarily be a parent, but a primary caregiver. So if your granny took care of you when you're growing up, or your sister or your auntie, and then they migrated. So it was really migratory separation I started looking into, because I really was finding that there were several varying presenting concerns, and they had that as a common denominator. And so my work, after I stopped, my interest was piqued clinically. I started reading up on it and realized there was not much on the area. I know that a social worker from Jamaica, Claudette Crawford Brown, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she's actually the social worker who coined the term barrel children. And so I met with her and just sort of threw out some of the ideas I had. And then I just said, let me start researching this. So I started doing research on it, primarily within like inner city communities or lower, those of the lower socioeconomic status, because I started realizing that there were different types of migration, and sometimes that was determined by economic factors. And the migratory separation or the migratory loss that I was seeing in terms of my clinical practice was more to do with those who are not necessarily middle class, but more working class of a lower socioeconomic strata. So I did a lot of research in that area. And so that's really how it actually started. I must also say as well that I was easily able to do that because I piggybacked on the area that I specialized in when I was doing my doctorate, was grief and loss. It was with cancer patients who had a terminal diagnosis, terminal stage, and so I worked with them and the family members pre and post bereavement. So my entry into the field of loss actually started with that area. But then when I came home, so that was done in the UK, when I returned to Jamaica, I wanted to broaden the scope of loss from not just death loss, but non-death loss as well. And then I realized that migratory separation is a loss. And so I started framing it within that framework. And so that's how I've been able to really delve in it, because it really is linked a lot with loss experiences.
You had mentioned earlier that there are various patterns or types of migration. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. I would say that I encountered about 4 primary types of migratory separation or migration. Let me just say 4 types of migration. So we have seasonal migration, which is very traditional within Jamaica and the Caribbean. And that seasonal migration started way back in the 60s when farm workers would go overseas, North America, Canada, stay for up to about 6 months or a little over 6 months, and then return home. So we have the seasonal migration. And it actually worked well for years because it was primarily the father, the farm worker who was the father who was going, but was leaving behind a stable household with mother, extended family, so the children were supported. So that was the initial, I would say, introduction to migration, seasonal migration. Then seasonal migration has now tweaked a bit, because even though we still have persons who are going overseas seasonally on particular contracts, the time period, the duration has lengthened. So we have nurses, we have teachers, they're going for like 2 years. It's also no longer the father leaving mother and an extended family. And so there's a lot more disruption that can occur when the primary caregiver of the children, the mother, migrates, and the duration is longer. So, but that is still considered seasonal, because usually within that contract period, they can come home for a little and then go back, but they're on a contract for a particular time. We also have the parental migration, I call that one, and that is really when parents would migrate and have no intention of having their children live in the parents' adopted country. They prefer the educational system here. They recognize the support system is here in terms of extended family, etc. But for economic reasons, they can't make it here. And so they migrate and send stuff back, and the barrel children syndrome evolved out of that. So they would pack a barrel with material things, send it home, etc., etc. So that was another group that I was finding, which I called the parental migration group. We then have family migration, which is the entire family migrating together. Now, when the family migrates together, I kind of found that was more middle class sort of phenomena, because it was the presentation was totally different. It's not like a loss or a separation. The family's growing up, but still there are times when you would get the loss being loss of country and loss of culture and that sort of loss. It was not the separation from a primary caregiver, but there were still loss elements within the family migrating. And then there is another migration, which I sort of termed serial migration now, and not just me, but others have termed it that, serial migration. And that is when a primary caregiver or a parent would migrate and send for, with the intention, the plan is to send for family, but they all can't migrate at once, because maybe a sister filed for her brother, and then the brother is now up there and going to file for his children, and then the children, one of the children filed for the mother. So it is that sort of serial family members joining each other over, and can be a protracted period of time. So again, there would be the disruption in the family, the loss, the separation, all of that. So within all four, there are elements of loss and separation, but it can be, it's not equal. You know, there can be variations in terms of the impact of the different migrations.
As I was listening to you, I was reflecting that I know someone, or I have personally experienced every one of those categories, which is to speak to how commonplace the migration experience is for Jamaicans and Caribbean nationals at large.
There was actually, but again, this is dated data. This is like early 2000, where we are trying to capture. And I remember Trinidad's rate was much less than ours, but it was like a 10%. So 1 in 10 is still high, but we were like 30%. This is parental migration only. This is when the parents go ahead and separate from the children. Sometimes the parents will send for the child, so it crosses over into a serial migration, but sometimes not. But it's a separation of parent and child. And so we would find that there was about a 30% rate in Jamaica, a 10% in Trinidad. We got data on those two Caribbean islands. But I just wanted to support the point that you made. It is common. And a little later on, that actually understanding the commonality, the commonness of it, is one of the factors that influences the grief response. And I'll speak to that a little bit later when we look at other areas that you want to sort of explore. Within our different forms of migration, you have illegal migration, which is a clandestine migration, which is fairly common. I mean, I know that North America has been trying to shut down the borders of illegal immigrants. And I'm not talking necessarily boat people. That's a more recent phenomenon within Jamaica. In other islands have had it for a while, but there are persons who will just go up on a visit and remain, which is what sometimes we don't even have to go to college. These are persons who know that they're actually not coming back, go on a visit and remain. But what you said, the unplanned one, where the college student or whoever had no intentions of staying, but maybe met someone over there and wants to stay or got a really good job or whatever it is, they're still illegal. When it's clandestine or illegal, there are serious social implications and consequences that affect mental health of both the person who is there and those that have left behind. But let me see if I can just narrow down a little bit with the college students, since you mentioned that if it is that there is no illegality, suppose they have their paperwork, etc., then they can go back and forth. So it is not as harrowing. I don't find the mental health consequences as great if they've decided to live there. It's not that they're not missing and have lost experiences and try to retain their culture in different ways and are even a lot more speaking in the patois than those who are local, as just a way to retain their identity. I'm not saying that you won't find that, but the mental health, the significant mental health consequences, I don't think that it would be the same as someone who has their paperwork. So you understand, and a lot of my work has been done with those who were the ones who planned to go but have no paperwork, or even if they are legitimate, but there is just the separation from family members, etc.
Mm-hmm. So thank you again for this introduction to the types of migration, to the body of work that you've done. We thank you for your work, and we will be talking next time about the impact of migration. Thank you, Prof. Pottinger.